Imagine waking up to a world where the knives are still. The smoke no longer rises from slaughterhouses, and the oldest habit of humanity has quietly ended. No laws, no collapse, just a shared decision that echoes across farms, cities, and forests alike. This is not a story about food. It's a story about power, compassion, and what happens when an entire species pauses and chooses differently.
1. The morning after the last slaughterhouse. The change did not arrive with fireworks. No sirens wailed, no flags were raised. The world simply woke up one morning and did not kill animals for food anymore. In Chicago, a man unlocked a building he had worked in for 30 years. He stood still in the doorway, keys dangling like loose thoughts. The machines were silent. No conveyor belts, no steam. No sound except his own breathing. Somewhere deep inside the building, stainless steel reflected a future it had never been designed for. In rural Argentina, grass grew longer than it had in decades. Cows still grazed, but fewer of them. Some were tagged for sanctuaries. Some wandered unclaimed, confused beneficiaries of a global decision they would never understand. And in 1,000 kitchens, people opened their refrigerators with a familiar reflex and an unfamiliar certainty. Today, like yesterday, there would be no meat. Not because of scarcity, not because of law, because everyone, everywhere, had decided not to. This is the world we are about to enter. 2. The decision that no one thought possible. For centuries, eating animals was considered not just normal, but necessary. It was stitched into culture, tradition, identity. To refuse it was eccentric at best, insulting at worst. So how did everyone become vegan? In this thought experiment, it was not a single event, it was a convergence. Climate data became impossible to ignore. Medical journals stopped hedging. Images from industrial farms leaked faster than they could be buried. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea shifted from "can we" to "why aren't we?" The tipping point arrived not with a revolution, but with a shrug. One day, the global majority looked at the practice of breeding, confining, and killing billions of sentient beings each year and thought, this feels outdated. History is full of such moments. Practices once defended as natural later looked barbaric in hindsight. This was one of them. 3. The planet takes a breath. From orbit, the Earth did not look different at first. Blue, green, familiar. But the numbers changed quickly. Animal agriculture had been responsible for roughly 14 to 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending on the method of calculation. Methane from cattle, nitrous oxide from manure, carbon dioxide from deforestation. When the last slaughterhouse closed, these emissions did not vanish overnight, but they began to fall. Steeply. Within a decade, atmospheric methane levels dropped noticeably. Methane is a short-lived but powerful greenhouse gas. Remove the source, and the effect is fast. Forests began to return, not symbolically, literally. Land once used to grow feed crops, soy and corn destined for animals rather than humans, was no longer needed at that scale. Vast areas were rewilded. Some became carbon sinks. Some were allowed to heal on their own terms, messy and unplanned. The Amazon, long described as a tipping point away from collapse, steadied itself. Rivers ran cooler without cattle trampling their banks. Coral reefs still struggled, but the rate of warming slowed just enough to buy time. The planet did not become pristine, but for the first time in generations, it stopped bleeding so fast. 4. The food question everyone asked. But can we feed everyone? This question had always hovered over veganism like a raised eyebrow. The answer, supported by agricultural science, was quietly ironic. We already were. Or rather, we already could have been. A significant portion of global cropland had been used to grow food for animals, not people. When animals were removed from the equation, caloric efficiency increased dramatically. Studies had long shown that plant-based food systems could feed billions more humans, using less land, less water, and less energy. Water usage plummeted. Producing a kilogram of beef had once required thousands of liters of water. Lentils needed a fraction of that. Rice, beans, wheat, potatoes. Old staples suddenly felt futuristic. Hunger did not disappear. Politics and inequality did not evaporate. But scarcity was no longer defended as an inevitability of biology. It was exposed as a problem of distribution and will. For the first time, famine felt solvable.
5. The body learns a new language.
At first, doctors were cautious. They had been trained in a world where animal protein was the gold standard, where milk was synonymous with calcium, where iron came with a side of muscle tissue. But the data arrived, patient by patient. Cholesterol levels dropped across populations. Rates of ischemic heart disease declined. Type 2 diabetes became less common in regions where whole food, plant-based diets were adopted rather than processed substitutes. Cancer rates shifted in complex ways. Not all cancers declined, but some of the most common ones, colorectal and certain hormone-related cancers, became less frequent. The gut microbiome changed. Scientists noticed something fascinating. When diets became rich in fiber and diverse plant compounds, the bacterial ecosystems inside human intestines became more varied. Inflammation markers dropped, immune systems recalibrated. People did not become immortal, but many became less sick. Hospitals grew quieter in small, measurable ways. 6. The psychological aftershock. Something unexpected happened. People felt lighter, not just physically. The daily cognitive dissonance of caring about animals while eating them dissolved. Children stopped asking why pigs were different from dogs. Adults stopped inventing answers that never quite satisfied them. There was grief, too, for generations of harm, for traditions re-examined, for grandparents whose recipes were now museum pieces. But there was also relief, a subtle psychological tension, one so normalized it had been invisible, released its grip. Studies began to suggest lower levels of moral stress and compassion fatigue in societies that no longer relied on systematic animal harm. Empathy, it turned out, was not a finite resource. 7. The industries that had to become something else. Millions of people had once worked in animal agriculture. This did not disappear without consequence. There were protests, transitional crises. Regions economically dependent on livestock struggled. Governments had to intervene, not with platitudes, but with policy. Slaughterhouse workers, long subjected to some of the highest rates of PTSD and workplace injury, were retrained. Some became mechanics maintaining vertical farms. Some moved into ecosystem restoration. Some needed years before they could work near machinery again. Farmers were not villains in this story. They were survivors of a system that had demanded impossible margins and rewarded scale over care. Many became growers of legumes, grains, mushrooms. Some managed sanctuaries. Others left agriculture entirely. The economy did not collapse. It mutated. It always does. 8. The animals left behind. Billions of animals had existed only because humans bred them. What happens to them now? Not all could be saved. This was the hardest chapter. Some populations were gradually reduced through sterilization. Some animals lived out their lives in managed environments.
Others returned to landscapes that had not seen their kind in centuries, with mixed ecological results. But one thing was certain: no new generations were born into cages. No calves were taken from mothers by default. No chicks were ground alive on their first day of existence. For the first time since the dawn of agriculture, humanity stopped creating lives for the purpose of ending them. The silence in that fact was immense. 9. Culture rewrites its metaphors. Language shifted. Insults based on animals softened or disappeared. Idioms lost their teeth. New metaphors emerged, drawn from growth rather than consumption. Cuisine exploded with creativity. Without the gravitational pull of meat at the center of the plate, chefs explored textures and fermentations previously ignored. Umami came from fungi, from aged soy, from seaweed, from time itself. Food became less about domination and more about collaboration with biology. Holidays changed. Barbecues still existed, but they smelled different. No less rich, no less communal. Children grew up without thinking veganism was a choice. It was just food. 10. The long view. 100 years later, historians would struggle to explain how eating animals had ever been considered normal. They would point to scarcity, to survival, to inertia. They would show diagrams of supply chains and belief systems, and students would listen, puzzled in the way we are puzzled by bloodletting or public executions. Not because people in the past were evil, but because they were trapped inside assumptions that felt invisible at the time. Every era has them. This was one we let go. 11. The quiet ending. On a small hill once used as pasture, a forest grew. Not planted, not planned, just allowed. A child walked through it with their grandparent, stepping over roots that had cracked old fencing. Birds nested where there had once been silence. Insects stitched the air together with motion.
The grandparent tried to explain how this place used to look. The child listened politely, then asked a simple question. "Why didn't you change sooner?" The grandparent thought for a long time. Because the hardest thing for a species to do is question what feels normal. Because habits can masquerade as destiny. Because empathy often arrives late. They did not say any of this. They just said, "We didn't know how yet." The child nodded, satisfied, and ran ahead into the trees. 12. Final thought. A vegan world would not be perfect, but it would be quieter in certain ways, healthier in measurable ones, kinder by design, not by exception. It would be a world where survival no longer required turning away from suffering, where the cost of a meal was no longer paid by someone else's life, where the future tasted different, not because it was synthetic, but because it was finally honest. And perhaps that is the strangest part. The world did not end when everyone became vegan. It simply began telling a different story about itself.